Have you ever looked at someone much older, maybe a parent, a grandparent, and quietly wondered what happened to the person they used to be? Not in a judgmental way, just with a kind of silent confusion, like time reshaped them into someone you barely recognize. And maybe lately, you've started to wonder if that's happening to you too. If so, you're not alone. Because the truth is, aging doesn't just happen to the body, it happens to the self. And most people don't see it clearly until it's already changed them. That realization started for me during a quiet dinner with someone I admired deeply, and what he asked me that night still echoes years later. Um, I was having dinner with a man I deeply respect, a mentor, you could say, though we never used those kinds of titles. He was in his late 80s at the time, retired physicist, brilliant mind, had done early work on electric propulsion systems long before it was cool. We were eating at this unremarkable place in Palo Alto. The food was forgettable, but I remember the way he spoke always, slowly, like he was decoding something in real time. We talked about energy systems, the usual. He'd been following the solar initiatives I was involved with, and had a few pointed thoughts, mostly about entropy and why batteries still weren't good enough. Then at one point, between bites of grilled salmon, he set down his fork, looked across the table, and said, "Do you know what aging really is, Elon? Not biologically, personally." I didn't answer right away. He smiled and leaned back. "You'll think about that one later." And he was right. I did. For days after, that question kept resurfacing, not just in the conscious part of my mind, but underneath it. You know, like when a system process is running in the background, quietly consuming memory. I'd always seen aging as a biological inevitability, cell replication, telomere shortening, mitochondrial decay, the standard wear and tear model. Engineering trains you to see failure points as data. But this wasn't that. He wasn't asking about systems. He was asking about meaning. I think it's easy, especially in tech, to forget that we're not exempt from the same arcs as everyone else. You can build rockets, you can launch cars into space, you can work 120 hours a week for decades, but time just keeps compiling in the background. And you don't notice the creeping changes until one day you're not being asked to build anymore, you're being asked to explain. That was the thing about my mentor. He'd seen this before. People like him who had once shaped the future ended up sidelined quietly. Not out of malice, just momentum. The world spins forward and assumes your orbit will decay eventually. He wasn't bitter. That's what struck me. Just curious. Curious in a way that unnerved me. There was a moment, and I remember this with almost uncomfortable clarity, when he looked at the younger people seated at the table next to us. College age, startup energy, that lean forward intensity. And he said, "They think they'll never run out of time. I used to think that too. It's the last illusion to go." That stuck with me, because I'd never really considered what aging feels like. Not just what it looks like under a microscope or how it's treated pharmaceutically, but what it means to slowly watch the world stop reflecting you back. To become a ghost in rooms you used to own. That night, I walked home instead of calling a ride. It was cold. I didn't mind. The question kept looping. What is aging, personally? I didn't have an answer then. I still don't. But I started to realize something else we're not taught to ask the question in the first place. And that made me wonder what else we're not taught. What else are we handed, silently, that shapes how we decay? That's where it really begins. When you're young, time feels like a resource, not infinite exactly, but close enough that you don't bother to measure it, you don't budget time, you just spend it, like oxygen. It's only later, when the tank starts to run low, that you realize how much you've burned through just keeping the engine idling. As a kid, I used to watch my grandfather sit for hours at a time without speaking. He lived on a small plot of land in South Africa, out past Pretoria. No internet, no noise, just books, clocks, and a workbench that always smelled faintly of solder. I thought he was just old. That was the word I used, without context. Old. Like a worn-out machine. But I never asked what was going through his mind, during those silences. I assumed, as most people do, that aging was a kind of background process, something that happened around you, like weather, not something that slowly rewrote the entire program. It's a lie we inherit without even knowing we've been told it. Society treats aging like a downgrade cycle. New versions come in, old ones get deprecated. No one says it out loud, but it's coded into everything, into hiring practices, into advertising, into how we talk about relevance. If you're not running the latest OS, metaphorically speaking, people stop trying to interact with your interface. And so we begin to internalize it quietly, incrementally. You stop learning the new language. You stop following the conversation. You assume you're not meant to participate. And the worst part is it feels rational, because we've engineered a world that rarely lets older minds feel vital. There's something tragic in that, not because it's cruel, but because it's efficient. That's the real danger. When a system is built for speed, it eventually starts cutting weight, and experience is heavy. Wisdom doesn't scale well. It's not clean data. It's messy, nuanced, context-dependent, not something you can plug into a dashboard and optimize. But we need it, desperately. I remember talking to a younger engineer at Tesla once, bright guy, brilliant really, maybe 23. He asked me why we were wasting time on something that clearly didn't work. I told him not everything valuable works right away. Some things are only valuable because they take time to understand. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Not yet. That's the cost of the lie. We learn to devalue what moves slowly. And aging is slow. That's its nature. It doesn't announce itself. It creeps in like latency. At first, you barely notice the lag between thought and action, between want and execution. But one day you do, and it's jarring, like waking up and finding your reflection outdated. So, no, we're not taught to age well. We're taught to disappear quietly behind younger faces, faster systems, and glossier interfaces. And once you realize that, you start looking at every truth you inherited about aging with suspicion. Which brings me to the first thing that actually goes, and it's not what most people think. Most people think aging starts with the body. Joints stiffen, vision fades, muscle weakens. That's what we're taught to watch for the visible signs. The stuff you can track on a chart or compensate for with medication. But that's not where it starts. Not really. What you lose first is urgency. Not time urgency. There's this quiet shift that happens, almost imperceptible. One day you wake up and you're not racing towards something anymore. You're orbiting. You're conserving. You start editing your ambitions down to fit the time you think you have left. That shift is internal, and it comes years before any real physical decline. I remember sitting with a former NASA engineer, brilliant mind, someone who once ran calculations for Mars gravity assist trajectories by hand. We were having coffee in Houston, and he was telling me about a project he'd been dreaming of for years, a new method for atmospheric reentry that involved dynamic skin response, almost like artificial muscle across a heat shield. It was bold, weird, possibly genius. So I asked him, why not build it? He paused, stirred his coffee for a while, then said, I think I missed the window. I didn't push him, but I thought about that phrase for days. I missed the window. Not it can't work, not I don't believe in it, just it's not mine to try anymore. That hit me hard, because if someone that sharp, someone with that level of vision, could talk himself out of building something world-changing purely because of age, what hope did the rest of us have? It made me realize that the real erosion of aging isn't always biological. It's psychological. It's when you start saying no before you even try. Not because you can't, but because the world around you has subtly convinced you that your era has passed. It reminds me of lithium-ion degradation. A battery might still hold charge, but the system begins to assume it can't. So it throttles performance, limits output, starts conserving even when there's power left. Not because it has to, but because it expects failure. We do that to ourselves. We start making decisions based on a fictional ceiling one that gets lower every year, not because of our true limits, but because of learned assumptions. And eventually, you stop chasing the thing that lights you up. You tell yourself it's better left to the next generation, that it's safer to mentor than to build, that your best work is behind you. And if you're not careful, that belief calcifies. You stop designing your future and start curating your past. But what if that moment, the one where you think the window closed, is actually the last chance to prove it hasn't? Because once urgency goes, risk is the next thing to retreat, and that changes everything. Risk used to feel like gravity always pulling me toward something, toward building, launching, testing, failing. Risk wasn't a thing to avoid. It was the mechanism, the cost of discovery. When you're young, that pull is intoxicating. You don't even question it, you just go. But as you age, the gravity shifts. You start calculating, not just whether you can do something, but whether it's worth doing at all. And that second question, it has a way of silencing the first. I've seen this happen up close dozens of times. Engineers, founders, artists, people who once charged into the unknown like it was oxygen, then suddenly they hesitate, they hedge. They optimize for predictability. And it's subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It's a quiet voice that says, maybe now's not the time. Maybe it's smarter to wait. But the truth is, that voice isn't smarter. It's just older. There was a guy I worked with during the early days of PayPal, brilliant systems thinker. He had this wild idea for a decentralized data sharing protocol, basically what blockchain would become years later, though none of us had that vocabulary back then. He drew it out on napkins, on whiteboards. His eyes would light up talking about it. But when eBay acquired us, he shelved it, said it was too risky to pursue, said he needed to be realistic now. I lost touch with him after that. And I've always wondered what would have happened if he hadn't slowed down, if he'd treated risk not as a red flag, but as a compass the way we did when we were younger, before reputation, stability, and comfort started interfering with our internal navigation. Because the slow retreat of risk, that's what really ages you. More than gray hair, more than back pain, it's when your appetite for uncertainty gets replaced by a craving for safety. Not because you've lost the ability to explore, but because the world has convinced you that exploration is no longer your job. And I think society reinforces this. Especially in the West, we build everything around youth. Innovation, disruption. We glorify the young entrepreneur, the 2-3-year-old founder. But you don't hear much about people who took their biggest risks after 60, even though statistically late-stage entrepreneurs are often more successful. It's like we assign risk an expiration date, but risk doesn't care how old you are. The unknown doesn't discriminate. It's still out there waiting whether you're 25 or 75. The only difference is whether you still believe the map has uncharted places worth reaching. And the irony is the older you are, the more equipped you usually are to navigate those places. You've already made the mistakes. You've already seen the dead ends. You understand failure in a way the young simply can't, not yet. But if you retreat too far, you lose the muscle memory of daring. And eventually you stop venturing altogether, which leads to the next realization, maybe the most painful one of all. And when the world no longer reflects you back, you start fading, even if you haven't left. There's a moment, and I think it happens differently for everyone, when you realize the world no longer responds to you the way it used to. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as walking into a room and noticing no one looks up, or making a suggestion in a meeting and watching it drift past, unanswered, until someone younger repeats it 5 minutes later and suddenly it lands. That moment can sneak up on you, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. I remember attending a tech summit a few years ago, not as a speaker, just quietly observing, no fanfare, no name badge. I was sitting in the back of the room, hoodie on, just listening, and a group of startup founders next to me started debating launch strategies for a new product. One of them mentioned trying to reduce latency through offloading something we tackled in early versions of SpaceX ground systems. I leaned in and offered a gentle suggestion about packet sequencing. They glanced at me, politely nodded, then went back to their discussion. No one asked a follow-up. No one said, "Wait, what did you mean by that?" And it wasn't ego, I wasn't hurt. It was just informative. Because 10 years earlier, that wouldn't have happened. Not to me. And it made me realize something. People stop looking to you before you stop having something to say. The signal doesn't weaken, the receivers just turn away. It's like satellite drift. You can be fully operational, still broadcasting clean data, but if the antenna isn't aligned anymore, the world doesn't hear you. And over time, that silence changes you. You start lowering your output, compressing your ideas. Not because you believe less, but because you're no longer sure who's listening. That's what aging feels like, in its quietest form. Not decline, not decay, just disappearance. And the world doesn't mean to do it. It's just moving fast, always optimizing for novelty. Youth becomes shorthand for relevance. And you, no matter how much you've built, begin to feel like archive software. Useful, maybe, but no longer necessary. There's danger in that, especially if you believe it, because when you stop seeing yourself reflected in the world, when your thoughts, your values, your memories no longer resonate with what's around you, you begin to question your own clarity. You start thinking, maybe I'm outdated. Maybe my time really did pass. And that mindset is corrosive. Quietly, steadily corrosive. But here's the twist. Sometimes the reflection was never accurate to begin with. Maybe the world doesn't reflect you back because it's too noisy, too distracted, too busy mirroring itself. Maybe what matters isn't being seen, but refusing to stop seeing what still matters. And that's where this myth of too late comes in, this collective fiction we all carry, that eventually your time to begin runs out. But what if that's not true at all? For most of our lives, we operate under this quietly destructive assumption that there's a deadline to everything. It's as if the universe handed us an expiration date on our dreams, our creativity, even on our ability to reinvent ourselves. I've encountered that notion time and again, and it struck me hard, especially in moments when it seemed to contradict every lesson I'd learned about progress and persistence. I remember a conversation with a 6-year-old coder, an unlikely figure in tech at that age, who reached out to me after a SpaceX launch. He had started learning to code just months before. He told me, "I felt it was too late to chase something new after decades in a different career. But then something happened a moment when I realized the sunset was just another kind of sunrise." His words were not dramatic, but they held a quiet, undeniable truth. He wasn't saying life could magically be restarted. He was saying that every tick of the clock isn't a loss, but a marker of continuous transformation. There's a powerful analogy here, one drawn from rocket launches. We often speak of launch windows, those fleeting moments when the alignment is just right for an orbital insertion. Everyone assumes that if you miss that window, the opportunity is gone forever. Yet, what we see in practice is more nuanced. Sometimes the window closes, only for you to notice that an entirely new trajectory emerges. It isn't about waiting for perfect conditions. It's about preparing to innovate, regardless of the conditions. Technology has a way of reminding us that every ending is kind of a beginning, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. I've often thought of aging in these terms. There's this myth almost universally held that after a certain point, the chance to leave your mark diminishes irretrievably. But in reality, it's rarely that black and white. When we realize our time isn't something we expend, but rather something that shapes us, we can begin to see that too late isn't an inevitable verdict. It's a self-imposed boundary, a limit drawn more by our fears than by our actual capabilities. I've experienced moments where I questioned whether I was still capable of bold moves. Not in terms of physical ability, sure, that too plays a part, but in terms of the courage to start something new, the boldness of a fresh idea. And then I would remember that every project at Tesla, every rocket I launched, was a product of stepping into uncharted territory, regardless of the appropriate age for such ventures. This isn't just about personal reinvention. It's a challenge to the societal script that whispers, your big moments are behind you. Every day, we're bombarded with evidence that innovation is for the young, the fast, the digitally native. Yet if you look a little closer, you see countless stories of individuals who broke the mold later in life, proof that the concept of being too late is more of a narrative than a fixed reality. In that quiet rebellion against the myth of too late, you begin to understand that our real obstacle isn't time at all, it's how we choose to use it. Every moment is a chance to learn, create, and redefine what's possible. And as I sat there pondering these ideas, I realized something crucial. That the next step isn't just about redefining time, it's about recognizing how our memories play their part in this ever-changing narrative. There's this assumption most people carry that memory is a kind of storage device, like a hard drive. You put something in, and years later, you retrieve it exactly as you left it. But that's not how it works, not even close. Memory is more like compression software. It doesn't store the full resolution of our experiences. It stores patterns, emotional weight, fragments, the parts your brain thinks matter most. And the older you get, the more aggressive that compression becomes. Not because your brain is failing, but because it's prioritizing meaning over detail. I learned that the hard way. A few years ago, I was having lunch with my mom. We were talking about something that happened when I was a teenager, a conversation we'd had that I always thought shaped part of who I became. I repeated her words back to her, almost verbatim. She looked at me, surprised, and said, "I never said that." At first, I was sure she was wrong. I mean, I remembered it, the tone, the timing, even where we were sitting. But then I realized I didn't remember it as it happened. I remembered it as it felt. I had layered interpretation on top of fact, and over time, the interpretation had overwritten the source. That was unsettling at first, because if something that foundational could be distorted, what else had been? But over time, I came to understand that this isn't a malfunction, it's a feature. Your brain isn't just recording life, it's editing it constantly based on what matters to you now. Memory adapts to context, to identity, to purpose, and with age, that becomes more pronounced. You stop remembering what time dinner was. You start remembering how it felt to eat with people you loved. You forget the name of the movie. You remember the silence in the room when it ended. The feel of things becomes louder than the facts. And in that way, memory becomes a kind of second language, one spoken through emotion, not chronology. This has deep implications, especially for how we see ourselves, because your story, the one you carry in your mind about who you are, where you've been, what mattered, it's built from those edited fragments. And when that narrative begins to shift, as it inevitably does, it can feel like you're losing yourself. But you're not. You're evolving the self, like a system being reparameterized, still doing the same job, but optimizing for different inputs. And if you understand that, you can actually start working with your memory instead of fighting it. You can start asking better questions. Not what happened, but why did it stay with me? What did I assign value to? And that reveals something deeper, the emotional code behind your choices, your regrets, your joys. So aging isn't just about forgetting. It's about distilling. And once I realized that, I began to rethink this whole idea of extending life, not just in years, but in clarity. Because longevity isn't valuable if it just stretches the noise. What we're really chasing is vividness. And that brought me to a much harder question, one I hadn't expected to face. If we do find a way to live longer, what are we really hoping to gain? I've spent a lot of time around people trying to extend life, doctors, engineers, visionaries, billionaires. Some are working on caloric restriction mimetics. Others are diving into gene editing, telomerase activation, cryopreservation, and yes, some of it is real, some of it works. We will extend the average human lifespan in our lifetime, probably more than most people realize. But the more I've learned about those efforts, the more I find myself asking a quieter question: what are we hoping to do with the extra years? Because adding time doesn't automatically add meaning. It just adds runway. And a longer runway without a direction is just waiting. There was a man I knew worked in biotech, extremely successful. He had access to all the cutting-edge therapies, stem cell regeneration, anti-inflammatory protocols. His biological age, according to tests, was something like 15 years younger than his actual age. But he didn't look alive. I don't mean physically, his body was fine, but his days, they didn't move. He wasn't chasing anything, he wasn't building, he wasn't loving, he was just maintaining, preserving. Like a museum curator walking through a gallery of moments that had already passed. It made me realize longevity without purpose is just a slower fade. There's a parallel here with electric vehicles. One of the challenges in early development wasn't just battery life, it was usage. If you gave someone a car with 600 miles of range, but they only ever drove to the grocery store and back, the capacity was meaningless. The potential was there, but the design lacked inspiration. So we stopped thinking about mileage and started thinking about experience. What's the journey? What opens up because of it? We need to think about aging the same way. Not how much longer can I live, but what becomes possible if I do. That's the real revolution. Because when people say they want to live longer, they usually mean they want more time with the people they love, more chances to create, to explore, to understand themselves. But those aren't time dependent. They're attention dependent. And attention is something we don't often preserve. In fact, the longer people live without clarity, the more their focus fragments, the more they drift. It's like orbital decay, subtle at first, then irreversible. And it happens not because they ran out of time, but because they didn't know where to point their energy. So the real challenge, as I see it, isn't life extension. It's life expansion. Depth, presence, lucidity. I've met people in their 90s who feel more alive than people half their age. Not because of their heart rate or hormone profile, but because they're still curious, still following the signal, still asking, what else can I be? And that brings us to something I've only recently come to understand, maybe the most important shift aging demands of us. The second invention of the self. Not a continuation of who we were, but a deliberate re-architecture of who we're becoming. We often treat identity as a fixed system like a spacecraft, built once and modified only when necessary. A defined structure, reinforced over years, optimized for stability. But aging reveals something most people aren't prepared for. That identity isn't a finished product. It's a platform, and eventually you have to rebuild it. The first self is usually built reactively, out of necessity, ambition, survival. It's shaped by the world around you, your parents, your schooling, your early failures, and breakthroughs. You make choices not because they're always right, but because they're possible. And over time, those choices congeal into a personality, a path, a sense of who you are. But the second self, you notice the small details again, the way your child's voice changed over the years, or how your father paused before saying something important. Time becomes not just a measure of life, but a mirror for it. And you begin to realize aging isn't the end of anything. It's the beginning of recognition. It's when the dust finally settles and you can see, sometimes for the first time, what actually mattered. Not the noise, not the wins, not the headlines, but the quiet impact. The people you influenced, the ideas you nurtured, the care you gave when no one was watching. That's the part 99% of people don't realize until much later, that aging, far from being a collapse, is actually an arrival, a coming home to self, to essence, to clarity. And if you're lucky and intentional, it's not too late to shape what comes next. If this message resonated with you, not as advice, but as a kind of reflection, I'd invite you to stay connected. There are more conversations to have, more truths to unearth. You can like and subscribe if this gave you something to think about. I don't say that as a formality, but as a shared step in building a future where aging isn't feared, it's understood. Thanks for being here. We're just getting started.